All right, welcome to today's virtual webinar. My name is Jamal Abdi. I'm the president of the National Iranian American Council. I'm here with some special guests who we will introduce momentarily. Today's event marks the 5-year anniversary, which I think was last week, of the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal and to launch maximum pressure. In that time, Iran's economy has cratered under sanctions, while its nuclear program has reached new heights. Experts now believe that Iran's nuclear breakout window has shrunk to a matter of days, down from a matter of months and even years previously. Iran's government has become even more narrow and hardline in its ideology and representation, and starting last September, faced massive protests that perhaps for the first time were focused on challenging the foundations of the Islamic Republic and continue to pose perhaps the greatest legitimacy crisis for the ruling government. Meanwhile, the Biden administration came into office 2 years ago, pledging to turn the tide on the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy, which many viewed as a disaster, given the state of Iran's nuclear program and all that I previously described. The Biden administration and Biden himself pledged to work on restoring the JCPOA, putting the Iran nuclear program back in a box, and even talked of broader ambitions of brokering regional talks to de-escalate tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on your perspective, Biden appears to remain stuck in the maximum pressure policy, at least maximum pressure light. And it was not the United States, but China who stepped into the diplomatic vacuum and brokered an agreement for rapprochement between Saudi and Iran. And this, as Biden's top foreign policy priority, Ukraine and the Russian invasion, has seen Iran getting far closer to Russia and even providing important support for its military adventure. So with the Biden administration apparently at this point unable to extricate itself from its predecessor's policy, with Iran's nuclear program seemingly on the brink of red lines, either articulated or that by Israel and the West, an increasingly hardline government in Iran, and the legitimacy crisis and ongoing challenges to the government and the regime of the Islamic Republic, the path forward seems to be as uncertain as it ever has been. So we are pleased today to be joined by 3 distinguished experts to join us for a discussion on what the path may look like. We have our first speaker, in no order here, is Joel Rubin. Joel is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under the Obama administration. He currently serves as the president of the Washington Strategy Group, a national security advisory firm. During his time at the State Department, Joel served as the chief liaison in the House of Representatives for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Oversight and Government Reform, as well as Armed Services and Appropriations. Joel carries with him decades of experience in advising, strategizing, and writing on issues of foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. Our next speaker is Dr. Behrooz Gamari Tabrizi. He is the chair of the Near Eastern Studies Department at Princeton University and director of the Sharmin and Bijan Mostava Rahmini Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. He previously served as a professor of history and sociology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign for Urbana-Champaign for 14 years, where he was the director of the Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. He's authored several scholarly books on the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and its aftermath. And finally, we have Dr. Shireen Saidi, who is the director of the King Fahd Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Arkansas, where she also serves as assistant professor of political science. Shireen is an expert field researcher on gender, activism, citizenship, Islamism, and the role of women in authoritarian countries. She is the author of the book, Women and the Islamic Republic, How Gendered Citizenship Conditions the Iranian State. So let's get into it. I'll first go to Shireen. So the killing of Mahsa Amini by the Iranian so-called morality police in September of last year was a spark of these massive nationwide protests, and which launched the Women, Life, Freedom movement, which was really not the start or the conclusion of women's activism for equality and human rights inside of Iran, but part of a long-standing movement, some could say. So I'm interested if you can talk us through what continuities are there with prior movements inside of Iran, put this in context of those movements, and based on that, how might we expect this movement to evolve going forward?
Thank you, Jamal. First, I'd like to thank everyone who's here watching, as well as the distinguished panelists, and also Jamal for all of your hard work in recent months. I thank you. That's a really important question to start with. So I think, at least in the mainstream media, there's this idea that this is the first time that we are, that we're witnessing women in Iran lead protests or movements. And this is simply not true. In the first instance, I want to stress that what we've been witnessing in Iran, which is really nothing short of reestablishing the social contract between the state and society. This would not have been possible if women were not already empowered, if this moment were not an accumulation of experiences and knowledge since 1979, we would not be where we are today with the wins that can in large part be attributed to women. So Iranian women have been at the forefront of resistance in modern Iranian history, but definitely since 1979. A lot of the literature that we read about women and politics in Iran tends to focus on organized activism. And of course, I mean, there's been significant work that's been done in that domain. So for instance, we had the Million Signature campaign that was quite active during President Ahmadinejad's presidency, and afterwards, after his presidency as well, for as long as the women could hold out, they were there. And there's still women who were involved with that movement that are present in Iran today, which I will reference their work, people like Nushina Ahmadi Khorasani. So a large part of our thinking has been defined by organized movements, but what we see in the Woman, Life, Freedom movement, uprising, however you wish to describe it, I don't think it matters that much the terminology we use to describe it. This is an uprising that was led by non-elite women that I talk about in my books. So these are women that are not affiliated with any organized political activism. They also tend to be women that have been overlooked by the state's policies and women's projects, gender projects that the state has taken on. So these are women that do not fall within that framework of advocacy that we see so often in liberal feminism. And so these are women that were active since the first days of the revolution. They fought alongside men during the 1979 revolution. They experienced prison and death the same way that they did. And post 1979, perhaps a dominant theme that we can highlight is the presence of mothers, Iranian mothers, and their openness to encouraging their children to fight for justice and pursue causes that are larger than them. So we saw women as mothers encouraging their daughters, sons, husbands to participate in the war. Again, these are women that were not affiliated with any organized activism or the state. We also see women demand women's rights and equality in the workplace. So for instance, in my research, I interviewed nurses in hospitals and doctors who fought for women to be able to come to work as they pleased, and challenged the state's tendency to want to regulate what happens within hospitals. So this continues. We see women who fought with their families, young girls, to stay in Khorramshahr and Ahvaz during the Iran-Iraq War to participate in the war. This history continues into the reform movement, where the presidency of Mohammad Khatami, the reformist candidate, was in large part supported by women and young girls. And it was when he came to power that, as far as I know, for the first time in modern Iranian history, the term citizen or shahvand was used to describe the Iranian people and defend their rights. This continues, as I said, into the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, where we had the Million Signature Campaign. And so, these are just some examples of women's activism. In terms of what to look forward to as we continue, I want to draw on the ideas of the Iranian feminist author, activist, and feminist based in Tehran, Nushina Ahmadi Khorasani. In a recent article, Khorasani stated that instead of trying to connect the September 2022 events to some future transformation, we should appreciate and ponder on the remarkable power of young women and girls to change, and the changes that they already made possible. So we see that women have not only gained autonomy over their bodies, but they have also fundamentally challenged, as I said, the political contract between society and the state. They have mobilized student and labor activists, and they have won the support of intellectuals and even many political elites. So I think instead of trying to connect what's going on in Iran right now to some kind of an imagined future, it's really important for us to cherish the gains that women have obtained so far.
So building on that, to you, Behruz, so for a long time, post 1979 and its aftermath, where Iranians saw one authoritarian government replaced by another authoritarian government, and there was sort of widespread understanding or belief that Iranians didn't want another revolution. They had seen one revolution, they didn't want to embark on that journey once again. Of course, as time goes by, memories fade, particularly for younger generations. I'm curious, what is your interpretation? Has something changed? What did change to enable such mass mobilization recently in the face of intense risks and given the historical context of revolution inside of Iran?
Yeah. I also need to thank you, Jamal, and all the people at NIAC who organized this. It's such an important conversation to have. I believe that possibly the most important achievement of the 1979 revolution was the creation of what I call in my own work hope-bearing and rebellious subject. And this is quite evident when we look at the post-revolutionary years, that despite the fact, as you said, that we face successive governments which are into different degrees are authoritarian, what is constant during all these years is the way people understand their own position as rebellious subjects and with expectations and a deep belief that those expectations need to be met by whoever who's running the government. And I think this is a very, very significant achievement of the revolution. So all the people who say that, we've really gained nothing with this revolution, and indeed we went back, some people say 1400 years, some people say 100 years, some people say. How many years? I don't know. But I think the very fact that we are sitting here and talking about this important moment in our own history is the result of that revolution. Revolutions should not be measured by their immediate achievements, and revolutions are long processes. And you know, when Kissinger was visiting China for the first time, and his advisors had told him that the Chinese believe that no other civilization comes even close to the Chinese civilization. The Chinese are so superior to the rest of the world. And Kissinger posed this question to Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, and said, so what about the French Revolution? What do you think about the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai responded that it's too early to say. You know? And I always say that, you know, it's so true for all revolutions. It's too early to say, because revolutions basically unleash a form of consciousness, a form of connection to the world, that it takes time, sometimes generations, to be realized. And don't forget that in the U.S., in France, in the UK, all these places that in one way or another have experienced revolutions, it took so many decades and sometimes centuries to see the fruits of that revolution. And those fruits come to bear with these constant, what we call a long revolution, that is a process of resistance, in the process of demanding desires, and how these desires are met. And in Iran was the same story. And I think that we need to understand that two processes were happening at the same time after 1979 revolution. And it might sound a little bit controversial what I say, that in so many different ways, the revolution, despite the fact that we have authoritarian states in Iran, but these authoritarian states also unleashed the possibilities of a lot of mobility in society. And this mobility that was generated after the revolution, particularly in case of women, you know, we have the numbers of women, educated women. Literacy rate at the time of revolution for women was only 23%. And in 20 years, literacy rate for women rose to 92%. And that very fact, I mean, some people might say that this was going to happen no matter what, but nevertheless, this happened under the auspices of the Islamic regime. And life expectancy for women, you know, all these things are very important, that while we have the imposition of these patriarchal laws and regulations and restrictions, at the same time, we see on the other side an expansion of civil society, participation of people. And exactly because of that reason, I said earlier that now women and other citizens believe that they share something in determining their own destiny, and they want to participate in it. And that participation, that desire, I think, is the most important achievement of the 1979 revolution.
I'd love to follow up on this. I want to make sure we get to all the topics that we have. So hopefully we can pick up on some of these subjects and dive in deeper. I do want to talk about, well, I want to go to you, Joel. You know, over the past 20 years, especially in the 2010s, there was a lot of talk about Iran's nuclear clock versus its democracy clock, and this perception, you know, after the Green Movement and as the Obama administration was pursuing negotiations, that there was perhaps, you know, there was this decision between making a deal with the government you had versus, you know, supporting change and then dealing with a new Iran. And I think, you know, this is a conversation that repeats itself and comes up many times. And it's one that today, as there is lots of activism and hope around the possibility for change inside of Iran, there seems to be some kind of disconnect about, well, there are these urgent issues that the United States and others take as a priority, I think, in terms of national security, preventing an Iran nuclear weapon. And that also, you know, forecloses on the conversation about, well, would a democratic Iran decide to give up its nuclear program and, you know, roll over for Western demands? I think that's another conversation. But so, Joel, for you, I guess in the here and now, we are facing this nuclear red line. Iran is enriching at 60%, something it had never done previously. It's closer to weapons grade. And you've got the U.S. apparently, you know, reiterating that, you know, the U.S. will not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons. More recently, Jake Sullivan making clear sort of that the United States recognizes Israel's freedom of action, which I think is possibly the most explicit recognition of the United States, you know, if not favoring, you know, giving a green light or not opposing potential Israeli strikes. So what is the reality here of the potential for Israeli military action, particularly given all of this and the political situation inside of Israel and, you know, the Netanyahu's return to power and what he's navigating? How serious do you think the possibility of Israeli strikes really is?
Well, Jamal, it's great to be with you, and thank you for organizing this to you and your team and all the work that you and NIAC do and have done over the years. It's a real value add to the debate here in Washington on exactly these issues, in addition to, of course, the work representing the community, the Iranian American community, which is such an important voice to have here as well in DC. And also, it's great to be with my co-panelists, with Shireen and Behruz. You know, look, to your question here, and I'll try to answer this as succinctly as I can. But it's an extraordinarily dynamic moment right now in terms of the calculations over what to do regarding Iran's nuclear program. And in large part, this chaotic dynamism is a result of what you framed early on in your introduction, which is the disastrous decision to exit the JCPOA made by Donald Trump and to pivot to a now clearly failed maximum pressure campaign of sanctions only policy towards Iran. And all that we've seen is that Iran's used the most frightening tool in its national security arsenal, its nuclear program, as a tool to create uncertainty and insecurity in the region, to try to leverage that potentially for sanctions relief that it was promised as part of that deal. And let's remember that that deal did do something that right now we're begging for, essentially we want, which is to curtail Iran's nuclear program, certainly to curtail its ability to enrich uranium, to engage in and for folks who aren't nuclear experts, forgive me for some of the terminology, but to ensure that there's a breakout time, meaning that there would be enough time between a decision to enrich uranium up to weapons grade, to have enough for one nuclear weapon, to expand that from the current 2 weeks back to the 1 year that we had at the end of the nuclear deal. And frankly, that's not possible. Right now, Iran has advanced its nuclear know-how as a result of being free to experiment because the United States broke the deal. And now the best estimates are that we could get a 6-month breakout period. And it's important to know, though, and this is critical, is that having enough enriched material doesn't mean that Iran has a nuclear weapon. And there was a debate, I'm sure many people remember it, back in 2013, an actual decision made by President Obama to talk about the red line being no acquisition of a nuclear weapon versus no nuclear weapons capability. And this capability question speaks to the question of breakout time period versus acquisition, which means having enough of that material and then fitting it on a warhead that's ready to be delivered, which could still take 1 to 2 years after having that material. So there's a lot of technical stuff wrapped into this. But to your point now, what that does is that creates a lot of strategic confusion about what to do. You know, what kind of policy will work to prevent Iran from getting that, crossing that threshold, that red line, that's still that acquisition red line, into a place where no longer is it possible to roll back their nuclear program, a weapons level program similar to North Korea. And then we're in a whole other dynamic. And then we're in a dynamic, and this is what is so confounding to me, is that for all of those folks in Washington in particular who are expressing alarm over Iranian actions in the Middle East, and there is a reason for alarm and concern. There's a reason for concern about Iran's involvement in Lebanon and in Yemen and in Syria and in Iraq. What they don't want to answer is the question of how well would that go for us if Iran had a nuclear weapon? It would be much harder. And so absent that, we're then left in this vacuum. And so we're seeing other players come in. And in some ways, maybe they're kind of bailing us out. We saw Iran now engage in a detente process with Saudi Arabia under the auspices of China. And that's something that the Biden administration welcomed because of our stuck diplomacy right now, is my read on that, and a recognition that reducing tensions can lead to other pathways. But you know, what then does Israel think, and how does it calculate? And I'll just add a couple thoughts on that one before pausing, which is that, to your point, the Israeli government right now is the most right-wing government in the history of the state of Israel. It just experienced several months of massive street protests opposing any reforms, quote unquote, reforms to the judicial system and structure of Israel by Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that worked. Those street protests have put on pause that process. Now it's being a discussion. It's a discussion behind the scenes. We don't know where it's going to come out. But President Biden leaned in there, and he leaned in at a critical moment. And he took some heat here domestically for it, but not that much, really, because the overwhelming plurality of our majority, of American Jews supported the president's call for Prime Minister Netanyahu to pull back essentially from that process. And so I think there's something to learn from that and to glean from that, which is that Netanyahu is going to push things as far as he can possibly push them, but he can be reeled back in. And we've seen that time and again, where President Biden and his team continue to reel back in Israel, because at the end of the day, everybody understands, the United States and Iran, that there is no military solution to resolving this complicated issue. Military option, but that option does not in any way, shape, or form guarantee Iran's nuclear program, accelerate Iran's desire to acquire a nuclear weapon. And with that reality, that means that diplomacy is the only option. And we're then back to square one, which is this dynamic here about how much time do we have to really move on a diplomatic process, while understanding that the diplomatic process and getting Iran to agree, and it's always bears repeating, worth repeating, that there's only
Well, it bears repeating, but Joel unfortunately will not be able to repeat it because his screen has froze.
Can I jump in for a second here?
Absolutely.
You know, one of the problems with all these conversations about Iranian nuclear program is that there's so much focus on the question of capability and not that much conversation about intentions. And these two tracks need to be done alongside one another. And capability is a very technical and logistical question, while intentions are political, and the possibility of understanding the Iranians' security concerns. It's not only, the fact is that it's not only the United States and European allies who have security concerns about Iran. The fact is that Iran also has concerns, security concerns about the influence of these powers in the region and their allies in the region. Most often, the concerns of Iranians are dismissed as paranoia and dismissed as unreal, while we all know that there's nothing about paranoia in operation there. It's a real concern. And I think the intentions need to be part of the conversation in order to address those security concerns that the Iranians have. And on the basis of that conversation, one can argue that why should they pursue a nuclear weapon? Unless we believe that they are sort of irrational, crazy actors, that there are no other possibility of having a conversation with them except with force and coercion, then that conversation is not going to go anywhere. And I think that it's very, very important that debate finds a central place in that conversation about nuclear technology, nuclear ambitions in Iran. And that idea of paranoia reminds me of, when the declassified documents of about Cuba came out, and the CIA reported that Castro was so paranoid because he thought that the CIA was trying to assassinate him. I said, well, if the CIA tried 19 times to assassinate Fidel Castro, then that was not paranoia, And we all know that it's not paranoia in Iran. There are real intentions of regime change in Iran, both globally and regionally. And this conversation about Israel, the constant campaign of sabotage, assassinations, attacks, And so I think it's a very, very important to think if there is good diplomacy, and the key term here is engagement. Engagement is the key term, and we need to focus on engagement, and good diplomacy would have the ability to see the world from the standpoint of the perceived enemy. And if we can't do that, we can't have a good engagement and diplomacy.
Joel, do you want to finish your point? Do you want to weigh in at all, maybe on what are the capabilities and the intention of the Netanyahu government, and do they understand? What is their view of Iran's intent versus its capability, and what are the factors happening there? And also, what do you make of the U.S. saying freedom of action, and how does that bode for the potential for military action?
Thanks. Yeah, and I hate it when that internet thing cuts us off in mid-sentence, and I have no idea where I ended. But to your question, look, without a doubt, there is real bad blood between Israel and Iran right now, and that's just obvious. And even the recent missile strikes coming from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad into Israel, and strikes back and forth, and in southern Lebanon, a lot of testing of Israel's Iron Dome capacity. There are major strategic fights happening right now, and sort of shadow wars between Israel and Iran. That's just a fact. I think the Israelis, you're talking about multiple layers, right? Just as we are in many polities. And in Israel, there's a national security apparatus of career experts that were very concerned about the Trump decision to withdraw from the JCPOA, because what it did was it took this nuclear question off the table in a verifiable manner. And so now, without these guardrails, it makes a lot of nervousness across the board. And even recently, the defense minister, the Israeli defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who interestingly was the person who sort of like it was the straw that broke the camel's back during the protests of several weeks ago. He was fired by, I should mention this, he was fired by Prime Minister Netanyahu because he publicly opposed the Netanyahu moves on judicial reform. And the day or so after, the Israeli politics exploded, and that's when President Biden said, "You've gone too far," and it pulled back. Now, this same defense minister is being very hawkish on Iran, very concerned. And I think this is where American foreign policy comes in, to try to take it up a notch. This is in many ways what we've been trying to, for 15 plus years, deal with, which is to not have Iran and Israel have a war, to not have Iran obtain a nuclear weapon and potentially open Pandora's box to cascading proliferation in the Gulf and elsewhere. We don't want to have a situation where every country in the region, be it like here, like Maryland, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, all having nuclear weapons and pointing them at each other, right? That is not a good outcome for anyone. And so that's where American diplomacy has to lean in. And going to Behruz's point, if I can build on that just a tiny bit, is this is where we must be creative and aggressive in our diplomacy. And I think, I'm not sure if it was caught or if my screen froze, but I do think that there are some lessons learned in what happened in the recent protest period, where President Biden spoke up at a critical moment. His timing is everything in politics. And he spoke at the critical moment that got Prime Minister Netanyahu to back off, pause, clear he had a. And I think that there are red lines for the United States. Military action by Israel is not something the United States is encouraging. In ways, when Netanyahu and the leadership of the IDF push more aggressively militarily, in some ways they want the U.S. to hold them back. It helps Netanyahu domestically if he can blame the United States. And they don't want to go it alone. Now, there are motivations to try to get the United States to weigh in and join in. But we've also seen President Biden hold back on providing some of the most advanced weaponry to Ukraine, for example. He gets a lot of heat here. But why? Because he doesn't want the U.S. to be in a war with.
All right, I think we've lost Joel. Let's keep going. So I think everybody or some of you have said diplomacy is the best path forward. I think it's hard to see beyond kind of three pathways here. So you've got where we currently are, which is Iran heavily sanctioned, maximum pressure sanctions, a U.S. embargo, extraterritorial sanctions, potentially. There's not much of an escalation ladder on the sanctions. It seems like many activists are focusing on Europe borrowing from what the United States already did under Trump in 2019 and designating the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. I think,
always at my key point, because
I think it remains to be seen, or even articulated sort of what turning up that pressure actually achieves, or how does it make any kind of measurable difference on the ground in Iran, or with Iran's calculations, or with the civil society inside of Iran being able to challenge the system. But anyway, so that's kind of the path that we're currently on, and it seems like we are almost frozen in place on that path. Then you've got the prospect for outside intervention, whether it's military action or some kind of stepped up campaign to try to destabilize Iran, or to try to support groups inside of Iran, and so some serious escalation, but some kind of an intervention that I don't think many are publicly calling for, but sort of I think there's a suspicion that that's the subtext of some of this effort to turn up the pressure here on the sanctions, and you run out of things to do there, then you inevitably go into either, the nuclear program gets to a red line and there's military action, or you have even more calls for covert action or something like that inside of Iran. And then you've got this third pathway of a diplomatic, if not a breakthrough, something to turn down tensions, change the trajectory. And it seems like everybody has sort of their preferred tactic or strategy. And they say the other strategy is going to be a disaster for, national security, international security, for the Iranian people, for everybody. Some say, diplomacy would be selling out the Iranian people in the midst of these, massive cries for change, because it would, I guess, give some credibility to the Islamic Republic, or it would allow, sanctions to be lifted, which, while it would be lifted against the economy of Iran, some argue that it would benefit the government more than the people. Others argue, well, sanctions are having this devastating effect on the Iranian people and undermining their ability to challenge the government. And then, of course, you have, I think, most people, we certainly argue that war would be the absolute worst case scenario for everybody in terms of security, in terms of the people of Iran. And so that's a long-winded way of leading up to, I guess I want to start with Shireen. What is your view on sort of how these various pathways, I mean, unless there is some creative new pathway that nobody's articulated yet, how do these pathways sort of affect the situation for the Iranian people and this, you and Behruz both talked about sort of the historical sweep of, challenging authoritarianism and fighting for rights of all people and women's rights. So does one of these pathways bode particularly well or particularly poorly? And what do you say to critics who would say that, diplomacy actually is just as bad as, a military pathway?
Yeah, thank you, Jamal. I think you did a really good job at explaining exactly where we are and how the options are becoming quite limited. There's a wonderful new book titled Backfire, and it's about how sanctions really don't benefit U.S. interests. It's one of the most recent publications on sanctions, and there's a discussion of Iran in there. And one of the main arguments that the author makes in that book is that although sanctions are really they're good at harming the state that's under sanction or the political figures that are under sanction, it very rarely meets the intention of creating regime change, as Behruz was articulating. And I really agree with that. I do think that there's some contention over this. Some people say that the intention of U.S. foreign policy is not regime change, it's negotiation. Perhaps, I mean, sanctions can be used for that purpose. But when sanctions go on for over 40 years and have no effect, the statistics, the science tells us it's very unlikely that sanctions are going to dramatically transform the approaches and policies of the Islamic Republic. What does create change in Iran are the people on the ground that are doing the hard work, are the community leaders, the political, the oppositional figures. It's the everyday people, as we were discussing, who come into the streets. That's where the real change occurs. What happens with the sanctions is that they place an overwhelming pressure on everyday people. We know, again, from the science that states are able, political elites are able to find ways to bypass sanctions. It's the everyday person that often ends up struggling with that. However, despite the fact that the science is quite unanimous about the ineffectiveness of sanctions, both for the country that is sanctioning, so the United States and whatever its interests are in relation to Iran, and the country being sanctioned in terms of changing their behavior towards democracy or whatever the framework is. Despite the science, what we see in the diaspora is this kind of what I like to frame as a fake debate about the benefits of this and how placing more pressure on the state will actually work. I think that's an indication that there's a lack of understanding about how sanctions actually work. So I will give you an example. When a country is sanctioned, even when there are targeted sanctions, what happens is that it becomes dangerous to work with. So to give you a simple example from my own world, as an academic at a university, my university, and I'm sure other universities have a policy that countries that are sanctioned by the United States, like Iran or Russia, even in the social sciences, so even if you're a sociologist or a political scientist like me studying just human behavior, you don't have access to any sort of confidential data anywhere. If you want to work with an academic, a scholar, or an activist in Iran, you have to report that to export control. So it's not only for inviting guests, it also includes simply writing an essay with someone. So what are the effects of this for human interaction? It's going to make it less. And this is a very light example that I'm giving. I think it's important to keep in mind that Iran is one of the most severely sanctioned countries in modern history. I mean, it is essentially under a financial embargo, which means that there are no transitions. It's not just that Iranian banks are sanctioned, but Iran is not allowed to use SWIFT transactions to move money around. So within this context, right, where people, the everyday people, are not able to have access to medication and other things that they need, there is this debate in the diaspora that while maybe, you know, the path to moving away from diplomacy is the path to democracy in Iran. And so in that effort, I want to highlight two things that builds on what Behruz said about Iran's paranoia not being uncalled for, and also Joel's comments about the importance of kind of rethinking US foreign policy. A lot of the leadership that has developed in the diaspora in the oppositional camp, they were funded by the State Department during the Trump presidency to supposedly take on civil rights activism online and challenge the propaganda coming from Iran. And instead, that funding was used to silence Iranian intellectuals, Iranian American intellectuals, professors, academics, activists, civil rights organizations such as NIAC. And so this created a platform which we see continued into today, which I view as sort of the rise of the new conservative right coming, you know, full force on the international arena and redirecting policy with fake information, fake news, and misinformation. And so for me, when one makes the argument that there has to be no diplomacy, there has to be no discussion, there has to be even more sanctions, even though we know it's not working and it's harming everyday people, when that argument is made, it is so ineffective that the only path that remains open is sanctioning and more sanctions and potentially war. So this is why I think it's really important for us to be vocal as scholars about the problems and the ineffectiveness of sanctions, and to really come together and think about new and creative ways to move forward. I think one positive thing that the United States can do is to formally recognize the activists and oppositional figures and resistance fighters inside the country that are pushing forth sort of the changes that they desire. And by formally recognizing them and seeing them as capable subjects in global politics and in local politics, it means not interfering in what they're doing, not sanctioning them, not harming them, but praising them and watching them to learn from them. So that's, I think, one thing that can potentially be done to avoid war, is for us to allow activists within the country to take the lead.
Can I add a couple of things
Absolutely.
to what Shirin said? Thank you. I think there are two different things we need to pay attention to about the question of sanctions. One is the stated objectives of these sanctions, and the other is the real outcome of these sanctions. The stated objective always has been that, you know, we are putting pressure to limit the possibilities and resources of the government and weaken the authority of the government and embolden people to organize against the government and put all these pressures on the government, to Iranian government, to come to the negotiating table. In any possible way, if you look at the real outcomes of this, we realize that sanctions has empowered the most militant and factions in the government. It never helped any democratic processes and changes inside the country, and it created a lack of transparency in the country that generated a form of crony capitalism that basically perpetuates actually the livelihood of the existing state. It morally is wrong because it has contributed to the misery of millions of people. And those people who think that misery breeds rebellion and revolution, they're utterly, absolutely wrong. If that were the case, we would have revolutions every single day around the world. The great majority of people in this world live under utter conditions of misery. Misery does not breed revolution. Misery disenfranchises people. Misery adds to hardship that people go through in their lives, and in fact generates a politics of despair rather than a politics of change and hope. And I think these are the real outcomes of these sanctions. And I had this conversation with people at the State Department, and I said that, you know, if we don't understand that the real outcome of these sanctions is exactly the opposite of what your stated objectives are, we are in real trouble if people at higher levels of this government doesn't understand. If you do understand that the real outcomes of these sanctions are actually working in contradiction with the stated objectives, if you do know that, we are in deep trouble. Because why are we doing this? In how many different ways we need to come to this understanding that sanctions basically do not work. Cuba has been under sanctions for 75 years. And what has changed there? Only the misery of people and people who can't mobilize themselves, people who are totally disenfranchised. And I think this is a very, very important point. And people who think that war might be one of the solutions, I mean, just a new study released in the Washington Post that puts the number of people who were killed during the war of terror to 4.3 million people have been killed, and because of that's the consequences of this war on terror. I think war is never the solution, particularly in this situation that we have already experienced in Iraq and in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, and so on and so forth.
So, Jamal, can I sort of add my thoughts on the sanctions question, though, because I want to make sure I'm on the record on this one. I don't think that sanctions as the sole instrument of policy or smart policy, but I also don't think that all sanctions are a failure either. I do think there is a role for sanctions in American foreign policy. And in some ways, certainly from Capitol Hill, it's a way to prevent military action. It's a way to show toughness, or it's a way to penalize bad actors. And there have been a lot of bad actors from Iranian leadership in oppressing human rights in Iran and in moving forward on a nuclear program that it shouldn't have. All that said, from my perspective, what we're doing right now and what we did because of Trump's decision is create a one size fits all policy, which is sanctions alone, and that in and of itself is going to be a total failure and not get us where we want to go. If you don't have a diplomatic process that functions where sanctions are serving that diplomacy, then they're just punishment. And so, you know, the sanctions program was traded back in 2014, 2015 for a specific outcome. And that is the kind of model that should actually be the one that we can look to as a way out of this conundrum that we're in. But going to the question of an Israeli strike and the potential for military action and war, I think that frankly the sanctions pressure that we have right now, in many ways can forestall that. But we have to match up, and this is what's so frustrating. Sure, you all experience this too, but it seems like one side agrees after another side disagrees. So back in August, September, when the United States and our allies on one side of the table pushed with Iran, offered a deal, Iran said no. Now there are mutterings that Iran will like that deal back, and our side says no. How do we get past that? This sort of thinking about it after the fact and realizing maybe should have made a better decision early on is what's really distressing about the moment. But the sanctions in and of themselves alone, absent a diplomatic off-ramp, are I concur, not going to get us where we want to go, either with preventing Iran's continued advancement of its nuclear program, or potentially the human rights gains and benefits that will benefit all of Iranian society. And I will say one more thing: military action, absolutely disaster for Iranian human rights. So for folks who are out there who want to say military action to replace the regime and get rid of it, let's start a war. We've kind of seen how that backfires in a horrifying way, as Behruz alluded to, in Iraq. The misery created by war is not just incalculable and was incalculable there, but it's highly unpredictable. I don't think anybody can tell us with confidence that there's a simple, easy military way out of this box. No, there's not. This is complicated. Starting a war will make it that much harder.
So we're almost at time, but we have some really good audience questions. So what I want to do is I'm going to read off a couple of these, and I'm going to give everybody just a few minutes to close out, and you can choose which question you want to respond to. Hopefully we can cover some ground quickly. So one good question. So somebody asked, for Iranians here in the United States, what is the most important thing we can do to support activists inside of Iran? Somebody else asked, is there a creative diplomatic pathway available that includes the nuclear issue, but also includes a human rights approach to incentivize the Iranian government to better address the demands of the women's movement? And then we had several questions about the Saudi-Iran deal that was, sort of China took the baton from Iraq and brought that deal across the finish line, and sort of what the implications are for that. How does that impact Israeli considerations? Does that tamp down the potential for a military strike? How does that affect calculations there? And then inside of Iran, there have been prominent Iranian political figures who have warned that there is perhaps a strategy to de-escalate tensions within the region while escalating repression internally. And does this deal give cover for something like that, so a phenomenon like that to be taking place? So that is a lot. And I will defer to our brilliant panelists to decide what you want to respond to, how you'd like to close out, but I leave it to you. So why don't we, let's see, who spoke last? Why don't we start with Behruz, we'll go to Shireen, and then Joel.
Okay, thank you. These are all good questions. I think the most important thing for Iranians abroad is to be the voice of people who are at the center of mobilizing and giving voice to these protests. There are strong voices inside the country. They've been working on these issues for decades. Many of them in prison, many of them outside prison, many of them under house arrest. And these voices are important. Am I frozen?
We can still hear you, and you're back.
Okay. These are the most important voices that the world needs to hear. And I think these voices come out in Iranian newspapers. These voices are published in books in Iran, and I understand that there is not that much of enthusiasm of projecting these voices outside because it really doesn't match the picture that is often drawn by the Iranians abroad, that Iranian society is such a repressed and closed society that no voices of dissent is ever heard. I think that's not the case. It's a very, very tight and repressive society, while at the same time, there are so many voices that are heard, that are spoken, and we need to be projecting those voices. And most importantly, also, I think Iranians abroad need to, especially in the United States, need to make sure that they push and they advocate a non-interference policy on the part of the United States government. We have to go back to the Algerian agreement during the hostage crisis negotiations, that the U.S. committed to a policy of non-interference, and the U.S. should stay true to that policy, because the more the U.S. tries to interfere, the more securitized Iranian society becomes, and it undermines the credibility and the effort of those in Iran who are working towards a meaningful social transformation, social and political transformation in Iran. And I stop here.
Excellent. Thank you, Darius. Shireen?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Behruz said. I think it's really important for Iranians in the diaspora to push for non-interference, and also just make our voices heard. That if the United States really cares about democracy and human rights, and there's a lot of question and doubt about that, I mean, in my own mind and heart, but if that is really the case, and there is this fundamental transformation in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, one of the best things to do to support activists on the ground is stop funding covert cultural, social, and academic projects. When this happens through the State Department, as it has happened in the past, what occurs on the ground in Iran is that individuals are harassed, they're arrested, and there's sort of this mass distrust of artists, intellectuals, and there is a dislike for international travel and so on. So non-interference means not funding sort of these covert projects for regime change. I think in terms of what we can do with one another as Iranians, first is to kind of control our ambitions and desires in terms, with respect to wanting to influence what happens on the ground in Iran. It's a different country. There are people living there. We don't live there. And there are moments where no matter how committed you are, what your intentions are, how scholarly you are, how well-read you are, it's not your place to speak. So I think it's, first of all, remember that you cannot be anyone's voice, and you are not anyone's voice. But then along with that, practice radical care, love, and patience with one another. I do think that even though there are not, bombs being dropped in Iran, whether we're looking at the tightening of control within the country or Iran's isolated position internationally, there is a kind of war happening, and women have been at the forefront of this. So practicing radical love and care with one another, I think, is a really important place to start.
Thank you, Shane. Joel, final word?
Well, there's enough of a track record here, and I think the question of creative diplomacy is one I want to jump on real quick, and that what can there be? And there's enough of a track record right now to know that we are stuck when it comes to diplomacy, and yet at the same time, diplomacy is not stuck in the region. We just saw the fight between Israel again and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and how did that stop? Well, the U.S. engaged Israel, and Qatar and Egypt pushed the Islamic Jihad and engaged them. So there are players here. There are multiple players. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been having proxy wars for a number of years now. Tremendous cost to citizens, civilians across the Arab world. And now China has stepped in. Now, there's a red flag here, of course. I didn't mean to say red to tip my hand, but Russia and Iran and their military cooperation is getting to a very high level. And that's of deep concern to Europe and the United States and others. It should be. But I wonder how far the Europeans and the United States, how far we can take this diplomacy without having these other players around the table. And that's sort of the question about how do you go big and rejuvenate diplomacy with get a very narrow objective here, preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon and preventing another major war in the Middle East, understanding, and this is just one person talking, but I would argue that we can't resolve everything at once. And that was the great debate that we had in 2013, 14, 15 around the nuclear deal, is that the opponents of the nuclear deal largely complained about non-nuclear related issues not being resolved, therefore no deal is worth it. And advocates saying, let's take this off the table and move to the next phase as part of that in the foundation. Well, now we see the results. The results are that dealing with the other issues it has not occurred. And in fact, Iran's nuclear program is advancing. And yet there are new players that are rising. And I think that that's how we have to start thinking about this and start working with other regional allies who have influence in Tehran. And we have influence in Jerusalem, in Israel, and we should try to figure out how to use it effectively and not get stuck just in this P5+1 process.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for sharing your perspective, for offering nuance. Great conversation. There's much more to discuss, and hopefully we'll convene a session like this or another format very soon. But in the meantime, I want to thank our distinguished panelists for all you do and for joining us today, and thank everybody who tuned in. Until next time, the path is uncertain, but we're going to do our best to try to figure out the best options and have an honest debate about those options. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.